48 hours earlier, Marcus had given the last $3 in his wallet to a homeless stranger. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't know where he had come from. And he certainly didn't know that the man could have bought everything inside the restaurant without checking the price. But now Marcus was standing at the back of a university boardroom, surrounded by lawyers, executives, and senior administrators, watching that same stranger walk through the doors wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a watch worth more than Marcus's yearly salary. The room fell silent. People who had ignored the man on the street were suddenly standing to greet him. Marcus couldn't understand what he was seeing. Then the university president turned toward him. "Marcus, do you know who you've been helping?" For a moment, Marcus couldn't answer. Because 2 days earlier, everyone else had seen a homeless man. Marcus had seen someone who was hungry. And that simple decision was about to expose something inside the university that even Marcus had never imagined existed. This is a dramatized narrative rather than a claim about one verified billionaire, university, or janitor. And that distinction matters, because the question at the heart of this story isn't whether a rich man can pretend to be poor. It's what happens when someone believes there is absolutely nothing to gain from being kind. Before we move further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the untold story. 48 hours earlier, Marcus was just another employee moving quietly through the halls of a prestigious American university. He was 49 years old and had worked there long enough to know almost every corner of the campus. He knew which classrooms needed cleaning before the morning rush. He knew which professors stayed late. He knew which doors were supposed to remain locked after dark. He knew which students were always in a hurry and which administrators never looked up when they walked past him. Most people knew his face. Very few knew his name. To them, Marcus was simply the man who emptied the bins, cleaned the floors, held doors open, and kept the building running while everyone else hurried towards something more important. Marcus wasn't wealthy. His apartment was modest. His car had more miles on it than he cared to admit, and he watched every dollar carefully. But Marcus took pride in his work. He believed that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing properly, even when nobody was watching. There had been a time when being invisible hurt. Years earlier, Marcus had stood outside a government office after receiving news that he desperately needed help. He remembered watching people walk past without making eye contact. He remembered how quickly a person could become invisible when everyone assumed someone else would care. He never forgot that feeling. That was why Marcus noticed people others ignored. And that was precisely why Daniel caught his attention. Daniel first appeared outside the university several days earlier. To anyone passing by, he looked like an older homeless man who had somehow found a place near campus. His clothes were worn. His shoes were old. His jacket looked like it had survived more winters than Daniel wanted to remember. But there was something about him that didn't fit. Daniel never begged aggressively. He didn't shout. He didn't argue when people ignored him. Instead, he watched. He listened. He observed. Marcus noticed that Daniel seemed to know the university unusually well. He recognized certain employees before they introduced themselves. He seemed to understand which administrators had authority and which ones were simply following orders. Once, while Daniel reached in his jacket, Marcus caught a brief glimpse of something beneath his sleeve. It looked like an expensive watch. Far too refined for the man sitting on the pavement. Marcus stared for half a second. Daniel quietly pulled his sleeve down. Neither man mentioned it. But from that moment on, Marcus couldn't stop wondering who Daniel really was. And another question bothered him even more. Why did Daniel keep watching the university? He wasn't simply looking for somewhere to sleep. He was studying the people who walked through those doors. One afternoon, Marcus saw Daniel sitting outside the university again. The older man wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't demanding money. He wasn't bothering anyone. He simply sat on a bench and watched students, professors, and employees enter and leave. Every so often, his eyes followed someone. Sometimes he looked toward the administration building. Sometimes toward the employee offices. Marcus wondered what he was looking for. Eventually, their eyes met. Daniel gave him a small nod. Marcus nodded back. That evening, when Marcus finished his shift, Daniel was still there. Marcus slowed down. Daniel looked toward the university doors, then back at him. "You work here every day?" Daniel asked. "Most days," Marcus replied. Daniel nodded. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do people here listen when someone has a problem?" Marcus frowned. "What kind of problem?" Daniel looked toward the building. "Any problem." Marcus didn't know how to answer. "Some do," he finally said. "Some don't." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's what I thought." Then he walked away. Marcus watched him disappear down the sidewalk. He didn't know it yet, But that strange conversation was the beginning of something much bigger. The next afternoon, Marcus saw Daniel outside a small restaurant across the street. The older man approached the counter and quietly asked how much the cheapest meal would cost. The worker glanced at him. $8. Daniel reached into his worn jacket. He searched his pockets. A few coins, then a crumpled bill. $3. He counted them twice. I only have 3, Daniel said. The worker shook his head. I am sorry. Daniel nodded. Thank you anyway. Then he walked outside. Marcus had seen everything. He stood near the entrance, thinking about the $3 in his own wallet. It was all he had left until payday. He had planned to use it for something small on his way home. He could have walked away. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody was watching. But Marcus knew what $3 meant when you didn't have much. It could mean a meal. It could mean bus fare. It could mean simply making it through another day. Marcus turned around. He walked into the restaurant, placed his $3 on the counter. 2 meals, please. Daniel looked up from the bench outside. A few minutes later, Marcus carried 2 meals to a small table near the window. He placed one in front of Daniel. Daniel stared at the food, but didn't touch it. Instead, he looked at Marcus. Why are you doing this? Marcus answered simply. Because you're hungry. Daniel studied him. You can afford this? Marcus hesitated. He knew the honest answer. Not comfortably, but he didn't want Daniel to feel like a burden. I'll manage. Daniel's expression changed. It was almost as if he wasn't looking at the food anymore. He was looking at Marcus. Finally, Daniel picked up the meal and began eating. When they finished, Daniel stood and held out his hand. Marcus shook it. You don't even know me, Daniel said. Marcus smiled. Neither do you know me. That doesn't mean we can't help each other. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Then he said something Marcus wouldn't forget. You really have no idea who you're helping. Marcus laughed softly. I'm just helping someone who's hungry. Daniel nodded. Maybe that's what makes it matter. Marcus turned and walked back toward the university. He didn't see Daniel watching through the restaurant window. He didn't see the older man reach beneath his worn jacket and pull out a phone that looked completely out of place in his hands. Daniel waited until Marcus disappeared through the university doors. Then he made a call. The person on the other end answered almost immediately. Daniel looked toward the university. I found him. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the university expecting another ordinary day. Daniel was sitting on the same bench. Marcus stopped. You're back. Daniel smiled. I didn't know where else to go. Marcus studied his face. Have you eaten? Daniel nodded. Yes. Marcus didn't believe him. Later, Marcus discovered that Daniel had received breakfast from someone that morning. But Daniel hadn't eaten it. He had quietly given it to another hungry man sitting farther down the street. Marcus was frustrated. You should have eaten it. Daniel looked at him. He needed it more. Marcus stared at him. For the first time, he wondered whether he had misunderstood Daniel completely. Over the next few days, their relationship changed. Marcus helped Daniel find the university's medical department. He showed him where he could sit without disturbing anyone. He brought him water. None of these things seemed important individually. Together, they created trust. But Marcus began noticing something else. Daniel's questions were becoming increasingly specific. He asked who handled employee complaints. He asked what happened when someone reported a supervisor. He asked whether workers had somewhere safe to speak if they believed they were being treated unfairly. Finally, Marcus asked him why he wanted to know so much. Daniel looked toward the university. Sometimes people need somewhere to speak before they lose the courage to speak at all. Marcus didn't know what to make of that answer. Later that afternoon, Marcus noticed Daniel watching an employee near the administration building. A young woman stood across from a supervisor who was speaking to her in a low, angry voice. Marcus couldn't hear every word, but he could see the fear on her face. She kept nodding. Eventually, she walked away holding a folder tightly against her chest. Marcus looked at Daniel. Do you know her? No. Then why were you watching? Daniel paused. Because sometimes what people don't say tells you more than what they do. Marcus felt a chill. The homeless stranger he had fed with his last $3 was paying attention to things most people never noticed. And Marcus was beginning to suspect that Daniel hadn't come to the university because he had nowhere else to go. That evening, a dark sedan pulled up beside the curb. A man stepped out. His name was David. He approached Daniel. Did you find what you were looking for? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. David glanced toward the university. And Marcus? Daniel looked through the glass doors. He's exactly what I hoped we'd find. By the following morning, Daniel's presence was becoming difficult for the university to ignore. Management had begun asking questions. Who was he? Why was he there? And why did Marcus keep helping him? Marcus was called into a small office before his shift. His supervisor closed the door. "We need to talk about the man you've been allowing around the building." Marcus knew immediately who he meant. Daniel isn't causing trouble. That isn't the point. He's still a person. The supervisor sighed. "Marcus, he's not your responsibility." Marcus remained silent. Then the supervisor delivered the warning. "If you continue bringing personal matters into this workplace, there will be consequences." Marcus understood exactly what that meant. He wasn't wealthy enough to lose his job without consequences of his own. His rent still had to be paid. His bills still arrived. There was no comfortable savings account waiting for him. But Marcus looked at his supervisor. "Then warn me." The room went quiet. By lunchtime, 2 co-workers had already heard about the warning. One told him, "Marcus, just stay out of it." Another said, "You can't save everybody." Marcus didn't argue. He knew they were trying to protect him. But he also knew what would happen if everyone followed that advice. Daniel would remain alone outside, and everyone would continue walking past him. Later that afternoon, Daniel noticed Marcus was quieter than usual. "They're punishing you because of me, aren't they?" Marcus shook his head. "You're not the problem. Then why are you risking everything?" Marcus looked through the glass doors. Students rushed across the courtyard. Employees carried folders. People moved through the building without noticing either of them. Finally, Marcus said, "Because I've been the person people walk past." Daniel stared at him. Marcus continued, "I know what it feels like to need someone to stop, and nobody does. I promised myself I wouldn't become one of them." Daniel said nothing. That evening, David returned. "They warned Marcus?" Daniel nodded, and he still stayed. David looked toward the university. "What do you want to do?" Daniel reached for his phone. "Move the investigation forward." The next evening, Daniel and David were assembling pieces of a much larger story. David had been reviewing employee complaints, disciplinary records, termination notices, internal emails, and files that appeared to have been removed from the university system. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Employees had complained about intimidation. Others reported unfair treatment. Some claimed supervisors had used their positions to silence them. But the complaints seemed to disappear. One former employee remembered submitting a complaint twice. "I reported it twice," she said, "and both times nothing happened." Another employee described being warned that another complaint could cost her job. A third discovered that the complaint she believed had been officially recorded could no longer be found. Individually, each case could have been dismissed as an administrative mistake. Together, they suggested something much more serious. Someone had been making sure certain employees were never heard. Daniel listened as David explained what he had found. For the first time, Marcus understood why Daniel had been watching the university. He hadn't been looking for somewhere to sleep. He had been studying the institution. He had watched supervisors speak to employees. He had watched workers lower their voices when administrators approached. He had watched people avoid certain offices. And now Marcus realized Daniel hadn't been watching him alone. He had been watching everyone. David's first lead pointed toward a senior administrator with access to employee records and authority over disciplinary decisions. The evidence looked convincing. Several altered files had passed through that office. Some termination notices carried authorization connected to that department. But David wasn't satisfied. He dug deeper. Then he discovered something that changed everything. The administrator had accessed some files, but someone else had been accessing the same records from a higher level of authority. The timestamps didn't match. Certain documents had been opened after normal working hours. Others had been modified shortly before disciplinary meetings. David compared the records again. Then he noticed the same authorization appearing across multiple files. It belonged to someone with more power than the administrator they had initially suspected. David placed the evidence across a table. Complaint records, disciplinary notices, access logs, internal emails, missing files that had suddenly reappeared. One name appeared repeatedly, buried inside documents few people would ever think to examine. Daniel studied it. "How long has this been happening?" David answered, "Long enough to become a system." Daniel slowly placed the document back on the table. "It's time." The next morning, Marcus was called to the university boardroom. He had no idea why. After the warning he had received, he assumed management had decided to terminate his employment. He walked through the doors expecting another difficult conversation. Instead, the room was filled with people he rarely saw together. Senior administrators, lawyers, department heads. David stood near the far end of the table, but Daniel was nowhere in sight. Marcus took a seat near the back. Then the doors opened. Daniel walked in. Marcus barely recognized him. The worn clothes were gone. The tired appearance had disappeared. Daniel wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, polished shoes, and a watch that looked more valuable than anything Marcus had ever owned. Two security officers followed behind him. The room immediately stood. Marcus remained seated. He stared at the man he had fed outside the restaurant with his last $3. The university president stepped forward. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming." Marcus looked at Daniel. "Mr. Reed," David walked toward him. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Daniel Reed." He paused. "Founder and chairman of Reed Global Holdings." Marcus froze. For several seconds, he couldn't process what he had heard. Daniel wasn't simply successful. He was one of the wealthiest people in the country. The man Marcus had watched count $3 outside a restaurant could have paid for thousands of meals without noticing the cost. He could have bought the entire building they were standing in. Yet he had allowed Marcus to believe he needed help. Marcus looked at him. "You knew all along?" Daniel nodded. "I knew who I was." "Then why?" Daniel walked toward Marcus and sat beside him. "I wasn't testing whether you would help a billionaire." He paused. "I wanted to know whether you would help someone you believed had nothing to offer you." The room fell silent. Marcus remembered the restaurant, the $3, the people who had ignored Daniel, the warning from his supervisor, the possibility of losing his job. Daniel looked at him. "You passed without ever knowing there was a test." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't know there was a test. That's why it mattered." Then Daniel's expression changed. He looked toward the university president. "You weren't the only person I was watching." The room became silent again, because the billionaire reveal wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Daniel stood at the head of the boardroom table. David placed the recovered records in front of the university's senior administrators. Daniel opened the first file. There weren't a few complaints. He looked around the room. There were 27. Marcus stared at the documents. 27 people had raised concerns about unfair treatment, intimidation, or disciplinary actions they believed were unjust. Several complaints had been altered. Others had disappeared. Some employees had resigned rather than continue fighting. Others had stayed silent because they were afraid speaking again would cost them their jobs. David began presenting the evidence. Digital access records, authorization codes, internal emails, disciplinary notices, recovered copies of complaints that supposedly never existed. The senior administrator Daniel had initially suspected shifted nervously in her seat. "I was following procedure," she said. Daniel looked at her calmly. "Procedure doesn't explain disappearing records." She tried to explain, but David displayed access records showing that several files had been changed after they had already been reviewed. Another document showed an authorization code connected to a higher level of administration. Then came the emails, messages discussing complaints, instructions about disciplinary action, references to records that no longer existed. The room grew quieter with every document. What had once looked like isolated employee disputes now appeared to be part of the system. Then an employee who had filed one of the complaints was invited into the room. She stood nervously near the doorway. Daniel asked her to sit. She looked at the recovered copy of her complaint. Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought nobody believed me." Marcus recognized her immediately. She was the woman he had seen near the administration building. The woman holding the folder. The woman who looked terrified. Daniel looked at her. Someone should have listened. She wiped her eyes. For Marcus, that moment explained everything. Daniel hadn't come to the university simply to find a kind person. He had come because people had been ignored. He wanted to know whether anyone inside the institution still cared enough to notice. And Marcus had shown him the answer. After the meeting, Marcus remained behind. Daniel approached him. Marcus expected a thank you. Instead, Daniel placed a folder on the table. Marcus opened it. The position written across the first page made him stare. Director of Employee Support and Community Outreach. Marcus looked up. "Me?" Daniel nodded. "You?" Marcus shook his head. "I'm just a janitor." Daniel leaned forward. "No, Marcus." He paused. "You were a janitor." Marcus remained silent. Daniel continued. "What you did with your last $3 showed me exactly who you are." Marcus looked down at the folder. The position came with authority, a salary he had never imagined, and the responsibility of making sure employees had somewhere safe to turn when they needed help. But Marcus wasn't comfortable accepting it simply because Daniel had discovered his kindness. He closed the folder. "I don't want this because you feel sorry for me." Daniel immediately shook his head. "I'm not giving you charity." He paused. "I'm giving you responsibility." Those words stayed with Marcus. Daniel wasn't offering him a reward for being poor. He was giving him an opportunity to turn the same compassion that had guided him outside the restaurant into something that could help other people. Marcus thought about the frightened employees. He thought about the complaints that disappeared. He thought about people who had stayed silent because they believed nobody would listen. Then he thought about the $3. It had seemed like such a small amount. Now he understood that its value had never been measured in money. It had been measured in what the decision revealed about him. Marcus slowly picked up the folder. If I take this, I want every employee to know they can come to me without being afraid. Daniel nodded. That's exactly why I'm offering it to you. Marcus accepted. Months passed. Marcus settled into his new role. His office was modest, but the door remained open. Employees came to him with concerns they had once been afraid to voice. Marcus listened without asking what position they held or how much influence they had. He still remembered what it felt like to be invisible. He still remembered the people who had walked past him. And he still remembered Daniel. One afternoon, Marcus walked outside the university. Near the entrance, he noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench. The man looked tired and hungry. Most people passing by didn't even glance at him. Marcus stopped. For a moment, he saw Daniel sitting there months earlier. The worn clothes, the tired eyes, the $3. Marcus walked toward the stranger. Have you eaten today? The man looked up. Why do you care? Marcus smiled gently. Someone once asked me the same question. Marcus sat beside him. The man explained that he hadn't eaten since the previous day. Marcus listened. Then he stood. Come on, let's get you something. There was no crowd watching. No executives. No cameras. No billionaire waiting to reveal himself. Marcus wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't thinking about his new position. He was simply doing what he had done before. He was seeing someone everyone else had overlooked. As Marcus walked beside the stranger toward the restaurant, he remembered the day he had spent his final $3 on Daniel. Back then, Marcus believed he was helping a man who had nothing. Now he understood that the real gift had been something much larger. Daniel had reminded him that kindness doesn't need an audience to have meaning. Across the street, Daniel watched Marcus disappear into the restaurant. David stood beside him. After a moment, David looked toward the restaurant. You knew he'd do that. Daniel kept his eyes on the door. I hoped he would. David smiled. Looks like you found the right man. Daniel paused. Then he shook his head. No. He looked back toward the university. He chose himself. And perhaps that was the most important part of everything that had happened. Marcus had never chosen kindness because he knew Daniel was a billionaire. He had chosen it when he believed Daniel had nothing. He had risked his job without knowing what Daniel could do for him. He had spent his last $3 without expecting anything in return. And months later, even after receiving a new position and a better life, Marcus was still doing the same thing when nobody was watching. Marcus once thought he had spent his last $3 on a stranger. What he didn't know was that those $3 would open a door he never knew existed. But perhaps the real value of that moment was never the money. It was the choice behind it. Because kindness is easy when there's something to gain. The harder question is what we do when we believe the person standing in front of us can give us nothing. Marcus didn't know Daniel's name. He didn't know his wealth. He didn't know powerful people were watching. He simply saw a hungry man and decided to stop. And maybe that's the real test. Not how we treat the people who can give us something, but how we treat the people we believe can give us nothing. So let me ask you honestly, if you had only $3 left and a hungry stranger asked you for help, would you give it to him? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'm reading your answers. And if this story reminded you that kindness still matters, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs that reminder. Subscribe to the Untold Story for the next story. Because sometimes the person standing in front of you isn't asking for money, recognition, or a second chance. Sometimes they're simply asking to be seen. And you may never know how much one small act of kindness can change. Marcus learned that lesson outside a small restaurant with $3 in his wallet. Daniel learned something too. Wealth could open almost any door, but it couldn't tell him who would still choose to do the right thing when nobody was watching. 48 hours after Marcus first met Daniel, the homeless stranger walked into that university boardroom wearing an expensive suit, surrounded by lawyers and executives. Marcus had looked at him and wondered who he really was. But the more important question had already been answered. Daniel had found the man he was looking for, and Marcus had become someone he had never expected to be. Not because he was chosen by a billionaire, but because, when the moment came, he chose kindness.